Occupied France, May 1940. The reconnaissance reports, filtering back to Luftwaffe Gruppenkommando 2 headquarters, painted a picture of almost absurd vulnerability. British ferry battle bombers, slow and seemingly archaic, were being committed to daylight attacks against German ground forces with devastating losses, their operational sorties often ending in a fiery plummet to earth. This perceived lack of aerial threat from the Royal Air Force's bomber arm, particularly its single-engine light bombers, fostered a growing sense of air superiority among German fighter pilots, a confidence that would soon calcify into tactical dogma. The stakes were clear. Unchallenged air power would allow the Wehrmacht to advance with impunity, while the Allies' inability to contest the skies would cripple their defensive efforts. Oberleutnant Erich Hartmann, a young fighter pilot attached to Jagdgeschwader 52, watched the after-action debriefings with a mixture of amusement and professional satisfaction. His Messerschmitt Bf 109E, a sleek, potent machine armed with two 20mm MGFF cannons and two 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns, represented the pinnacle of contemporary fighter design. Its speed, climb rate, and concentrated firepower made short work of anything the British put in the air. The battle, in contrast, was a lumbering target, its maximum speed of 240 miles per hour, barely exceeding the cruising speed of the Bf 109, and its single .303-inch Vickers K machine gun in the rear cockpit offered only token resistance. The technical specifications of the battle, a monoplane designed in the mid-1930s, reflected a pre-war doctrine that prioritized payload and range over defensive armament and speed. Its single Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, though powerful for its time, struggled to propel the 10,700-pound aircraft, fully loaded, to altitudes where it could evade modern interceptors. Production logs from Ferry Aviation showed 2,185 battles delivered by 1940, a significant quantity, yet their combat effectiveness was negligible against the modern German air defense network. The ideological implication was profound, the British still clinging to notions of bomber invincibility from the previous decade. Were sending crews to certain death, while German aircraft, designed for speed and aggression, dominated the new aerial battlefield. The early encounters established a clear quantitative disparity. For every German fighter lost in these initial Western Front engagements, damage reports indicated an average of 12 Allied bombers destroyed, a ratio that underscored the Luftwaffe's overwhelming advantage. This period of aerial supremacy, born from superior aircraft design and tactical doctrine, instilled a dangerous complacency among German air crews. They saw the Allied bombers not as a threat, but as slow, predictable targets, easy to dispatch with minimal risk, their vulnerability a testament to German engineering and pilot skill. This perception of aerial invulnerability, solidified by repeated, one-sided victories, would become a deeply ingrained aspect of their strategic outlook. The air above the Reich, early 1943, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, heavy with their bomb loads, lumbered eastward in tight, disciplined boxes, their contrails etching stark white lines across the azure. German fighter pilots, accustomed to the agile dogfights of the Eastern Front or the Channel, initially viewed these formations with a mixture of disdain and opportunity. The bombers, with their average cruising speed of 200 knots, seemed ponderous, almost static targets compared to the 350-knot Me-109 or the 375-knot FW-190. Initial encounters confirmed this perception of vulnerability. Luftwaffe pilots, often young and eager, reported little difficulty in closing on the formations. Interrogation files from downed Allied airmen frequently contained accounts of German pilots making multiple passes, sometimes even flying parallel to the bombers, to assess their defenses before initiating an attack. Production logs indicate that by early 1943, the average operational service ceiling for the B-17G was 35,000 feet, a height that still left them within the effective combat altitude of the German interceptors. The German tactics evolved quickly, exploiting the bomber's apparent slowness. Head-on attacks, where the closing speed could exceed 550 knots, minimized the time the bomber's forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns had to bear. Damage reports from the 8th Air Force in January 1943 show a marked increase in nose and cockpit damage from these frontal assaults. The perception among German fighter groups, as documented in unit diaries, was that these American flying fortresses were merely large, slow-moving targets, easily dispatched with a well-aimed burst. However, the fortress moniker was not entirely without merit. Each B-17G carried a formidable defensive armament of 13 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, distributed across dorsal, ventral, tail, waist, and nose positions. The rate of fire for a single M2 was between 750 and 850 rounds per minute, meaning a full formation of 30 bombers could theoretically unleash a combined fire rate exceeding 250,000 rounds per minute into the surrounding airspace. This dense, interlocking field of fire was designed to deter and, in time, to destroy. The early German successes, though often costly, reinforced their initial assessments. The sheer number of Allied bombers, rather than their individual resilience, was seen as the primary threat. Luftwaffe intelligence summaries from March 1943 estimated the average loss rate for attacking fighters at 5 to 7% per engagement, a figure deemed acceptable given the strategic imperative to halt the bombing campaign. The strategic implication for the Reich was clear. Sustained attrition of the bomber force would eventually render deep penetrations too costly for the Allies. The German pilots, full of youthful confidence, sometimes even engaged in taunting maneuvers, flying close to the bomber formations, occasionally even below them, before peeling away for an attack run. This bravado, while demoralizing for some Allied crews, also brought their aircraft into the killing zones of the 50 caliber guns. The B-17's design, with its multiple gun positions, meant that even a slow turn presented new firing angles for its gunners. The 50 caliber rounds themselves were substantial. Each M2 round weighed approximately 1.15 ounces, and its kinetic energy at impact was devastating to aircraft structures. Armor-piercing incendiary API rounds, comprising a significant portion of the ammunition load, were designed not just to penetrate, but to ignite fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. Production figures for API rounds in the United States soared, reaching 1.5 billion units in 1943 alone. Reflecting the strategic importance placed on this specific type of defensive munition, the initial German overconfidence began to wane as the cumulative effect of these heavy machine guns became undeniable. Reports from returning fighter pilots easily detailed damage to their aircraft, often from unseen sources within the bomber boxes. The slow, seemingly defenseless targets were in fact capable of carving lethal swaths through the air, transforming the skies into a deadly invisible gauntlet for any approaching aircraft. The summer of 1943 brought with it a distinct change in the character of the aerial battles over the Reich. Initially, the German fighter pilots, particularly those flying the agile Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, approached the lumbering American bomber formations with a certain disdain. Their combat reports from late 1942 and early 1943 frequently characterized the B-17s and B-24s as slow, ponderous targets, easily outmaneuvered and vulnerable to concentrated cannon fire. A typical engagement involved a head-on pass or a high-angle attack from above, followed by a quick breakaway, exploiting the superior speed and climb rate of the German interceptors. Damage assessments from these early encounters often focused on the visible effects of 20mm and 30mm cannon shells, noting large holes torn in wings and fuselages, and the occasional spectacular explosion of a fuel tank. The American bombers, though heavily armed, were perceived as lacking the offensive punch to deter determined attacks effectively. Interrogation files from captured Luftwaffe pilots consistently reflected this confidence, with pilots describing the 50 caliber machine guns as annoying but rarely lethal in the face of their own heavy armament. The prevailing tactic was to press attacks through the defensive fire, confident in the resilience and speed of their own aircraft. However, as the daylight bombing campaign intensified through 1943, a subtle shift began to manifest in pilot observations. While the initial contempt for the bomber's speed remained, the nature of the damage inflicted upon German fighters began to evolve. Previously, hits from .50 caliber rounds were often dismissed as superficial, puncturing skin or control surfaces without immediately critical effect. Now, pilots were reporting unusual patterns of damage, particularly to engine components and hydraulic lines, that suggested a more insidious threat. Unit diaries from Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2, operating in the western sectors, increasingly mentioned instances where fighters, despite executing what they considered successful attacks, were forced to abort due to unexpected system failures. A pilot from IIG-26, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, noted in his combat report from an August 1943 mission over Schweinfurt, the air was cut into lines. This seemingly poetic observation, embedded within a detailed account of an engine fire, captured a growing unease. The sheer volume of fire, once deemed merely a nuisance, was beginning to present a different kind of problem. Technical inspections of returning German fighters began to reveal a new category of damage. Instead of isolated large-caliber hits, maintenance crews documented numerous smaller perforations, often clustered in critical areas. Engine cowlings, oil coolers, and radiator systems showed evidence of multiple .50 caliber impacts, not just single, devastating strikes. The cumulative effect of these smaller, yet numerous, penetrations was often more crippling than a single cannon hit, leading to gradual but inevitable system degradation. Production logs from Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs factories indicated a rising demand for replacement engine components and hydraulic system parts, disproportionate to the number of aircraft recorded as total losses. This suggested that many fighters, though not shot down outright, were sustaining damage that rendered them non-combat worthy for extended periods. The attrition was not always spectacular, but it was persistent and corrosive, eroding the operational readiness of the fighter units. The strategic implication of this evolving damage profile was profound. The seemingly slow, vulnerable bombers were, through sheer volume of fire, creating a hazardous environment for their attackers. The .50 caliber machine gun, once underestimated, was revealing its true potential as a system killer. The German pilots, once so confident, were beginning to experience a new, less predictable form of aerial combat. East Anglia, November 1943. The returning B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, some limping, some barely holding together, offered a grim tableau for the ground crews awaiting them. Each aircraft that made it back was a testament to both its structural resilience and the sheer luck of its occupants, but also a stark, physical record of the aerial combat it had endured. The damage, meticulously documented by maintenance crews and intelligence officers, began to reveal patterns that challenged earlier assumptions about German air superiority and the vulnerability of the heavy bomber. The initial assessment of damage frequently focused on the number of hits and the size of the holes, a superficial measure that often obscured the true nature of the engagement. However, as the war progressed and the volume of combat increased, a more granular analysis became imperative. Intelligence reports from the 8th Air Force's Damage Assessment Section, compiled from thousands of individual aircraft inspections, started to quantify the types of projectiles impacting the bombers. These reports consistently highlighted a disproportionate number of smaller caliber hits, specifically from the 7.92mm machine guns prevalent in early Luftwaffe fighters, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190. The 7.92mm rounds, while numerous, often failed to inflict catastrophic damage unless they struck critical components or crew members directly. Their kinetic energy was insufficient to reliably penetrate the thicker armor plating around engines, fuel tanks, and crew positions. And the explosive content of incendiary or high-explosive variants was minimal. A typical B-17, for instance, might return with hundreds of 7.92mm holes, yet remain fully operational, its structure largely intact. This observation led to a dangerous complacency among some German pilots who, observing the apparent resilience of the bombers, underestimated the long-term attrition these smaller rounds could inflict. The 50 caliber machine gun, the Browning M2, mounted in defensive positions across the Allied bomber fleet, presented a stark contrast. Damage reports from captured German aircraft and post-mission analysis of Allied gun camera footage provided compelling evidence of its destructive power. While fewer hits from the 50 caliber were typically recorded on German fighters compared to the volume of 7.92mm hits on Allied bombers, each impact carried significantly greater destructive potential. The 50 caliber projectile, with its heavier mass and higher muzzle velocity, delivered approximately 4 times the kinetic energy of a 7.92mm round. This superior kinetic energy translated directly into increased penetration and structural damage. A single 50 caliber round could tear through aluminum skin, sever control cables, or shatter engine components with a force that the smaller German rounds could not replicate. Interrogation files from captured Luftwaffe pilots frequently recounted instances of their aircraft being torn apart by these larger projectiles, even when the number of observed hits was relatively low. The psychological impact of these devastating strikes was also noted, as pilots witnessed their comrades' aircraft disintegrating under the concentrated fire of the heavy bombers. The internal fragmentation caused by a 50 caliber round after penetrating the aircraft's skin was particularly lethal. The projectile would often tumble or deform, creating a wider damage path and showering the interior with lethal shrapnel from both the round itself and the ruptured aircraft structure. This effect was amplified when incendiary or armor-piercing incendiary (API) rounds were used, which could ignite fuel lines, hydraulic fluid, or ammunition stores. The damage was not merely a hole, but a destructive cavity, often accompanied by fire. The prevalence of these larger caliber hits on German fighters, though numerically smaller than the 7.92mm hits on Allied bombers, pointed to a critical asymmetry in firepower. While German pilots often had to make multiple passes, expending hundreds of smaller rounds to achieve a kill, the 50 caliber allowed Allied gunners to inflict decisive damage with fewer, more accurate bursts. The sheer volume of 50 caliber fire, with a typical B-17 carrying 10 or more such weapons, created a dense and lethal defensive screen, effectively cutting the air into lines of destructive force. This defensive capability, initially underestimated by the Luftwaffe, fundamentally altered the calculus of daylight bombing. Occupied France, August 1943. A Junkers Ju-88, its engines coughing, limped back to its base near Lille. Its tail section was a sieve of ragged holes, the control surfaces barely responding. The pilot, a young Oberleutnant, reported an encounter with a B-17, describing the American bomber's defensive fire as a wall of steel. This observation, initially dismissed as pilot exaggeration, began to accumulate, forming a pattern of increasingly severe damage reports from fighter units engaging Allied heavy bombers. Damage analysis reports from captured Allied aircraft and detailed inspections of returning German fighters provided the initial quantitative data. An examination of a shot-down B-17 near Kassel in September 1943 revealed its armament: 13 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns. Each weapon had a cyclic rate of fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. When all guns were brought to bear, a single B-17 could unleash a torrent of approximately 6,000 rounds per minute, a density of fire previously unimaginable in aerial combat. Further analysis, corroborated by gun camera footage from Luftwaffe fighters, showed the .50 caliber rounds, with their 45-gram projectiles, retained significant kinetic energy over considerable distances. The incendiary and armor-piercing variants, in particular, proved devastating. A single hit from an M2 round could penetrate 12.7 millimeters of armor plate at 100 meters, or ignite fuel tanks and ammunition stores with its incendiary core. The sheer volume of fire, rather than individual shot accuracy, became the overwhelming factor. The strategic implications for the Luftwaffe were profound. Early fighter tactics, relying on rapid, high-speed passes to exploit the perceived vulnerability of the slow-moving bombers, were proving suicidal. Fighter pilots, accustomed to the lighter armament of their own aircraft, typically 7.92 millimeter machine guns and 20 millimeter cannons, were unprepared for the concentrated defensive fire. The 7.92 millimeter rounds, while effective against unarmored sections, lacked the stopping power to reliably bring down a 4-engine bomber protected by multiple 50 caliber positions. Interrogation files from captured American airmen provided further insight into the defensive doctrine. The concept of mutual support within bomber formations, where each aircraft's defensive fire overlapped with its neighbors, created a lethal aerial box. A formation of 20 B-17s could collectively project a curtain of over 100,000 .50 caliber rounds per minute into the airspace around them, a truly impenetrable barrier for any unarmored fighter. Production logs from American factories confirmed the scale of this threat. By late 1943, monthly production of the Browning M2 machine gun exceeded 30,000 units, ensuring a constant supply for both new aircraft and field replacements. The sheer industrial output behind this weapon underscored the Allied commitment to bomber defense, a commitment that German intelligence had initially underestimated. The Luftwaffe's high command, reviewing these consolidated reports, faced a stark reality. Their fighter force, designed for swift, decisive engagements against single aircraft or lightly defended formations, was now confronting a heavily armed, mutually supporting aerial armada. The initial derision of slow, clumsy bombers gave way to a grudging respect for their formidable defensive capabilities, a respect born of mounting losses and the undeniable evidence of shredded airframes. Occupied France, August 1943. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses, 27 strong, lumbered eastward, their silver skins glinting under a high summer sun, bound for Schweinfurt. The German fighter pilots, veterans of the Channel battles and the Eastern Front, had initially regarded these American heavy bombers with a mixture of disdain and professional curiosity. Early intelligence reports, often based on captured airmen's boasts or exaggerated claims, had described the B-17 as a slow, heavily armed, but ultimately vulnerable target. Luftwaffe fighter units, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 Gruppen, had honed their tactics against unescorted British bombers, which often flew at night or in less dense formations. The daylight raids of the 8th Air Force, however, presented a new and increasingly lethal challenge. The initial German response involved head-on attacks, a tactic designed to exploit the relatively weaker forward armament of early B-17 models and to minimize the time spent in the cone of fire from the bomber's numerous waist and tail guns. This approach, while often effective in breaking formation or inflicting damage, proved costly. Damage reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2, operating from bases in France and Belgium, indicated a rising attrition rate for their fighters. For every bomber shot down, an average of 1.8 fighters were lost or severely damaged during these frontal assaults, a ratio deemed unsustainable by the Luftwaffe High Command. The concentrated fire from the B-17's 12 to 13 50 caliber machine guns, each firing at a rate of 750 to 850 rounds per minute, created a lethal defensive screen. Further analysis of combat film and debriefings revealed the devastating effect of the 50 caliber rounds. Unlike the smaller 7.92 mm machine guns or 20 mm cannons prevalent in early Luftwaffe fighters, the 50 caliber projectile carried significantly more kinetic energy and a larger explosive or incendiary payload. A single burst could tear through aluminum skin, sever control cables, or ignite fuel tanks. Interrogation files of captured American airmen sometimes contained accounts of German pilots underestimating the density and reach of the bomber's defensive fire. The 50 caliber rounds, often tracer-equipped, literally cut visible lines through the air, forcing German pilots to break off attacks prematurely or risk being shredded. The Luftwaffe adapted. By late 1943, tactics shifted from single-plane, head-on passes to coordinated attacks involving multiple fighter elements. One group, often equipped with 20 mm or 30 mm cannons, would approach from the rear or slightly above, focusing on specific aircraft within the formation, while another group executed a high-speed pass from the front or flanks to disrupt the bomber's defensive integrity. This multi-axis attack aimed to overwhelm the gunners and spread the defensive fire, rather than concentrating on a single vulnerable approach. The introduction of rocket-propelled projectiles, such as the WFR Gray 21, launched from modified BF-109s and FW-190s, further augmented their capabilities, allowing fighters to engage from outside the effective range of the 50 caliber guns. These new tactics, combined with the increasing number of heavily armed FW-190s entering service, began to take a heavier toll on the bomber formations. Production logs from Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs factories showed a steady increase in fighter output, with monthly deliveries rising from 800 in early 1943 to over 1,200 by year's end. The strategic implication was clear. The American daylight bombing campaign, while inflicting damage on German industry, was becoming prohibitively expensive in terms of aircrew and aircraft losses. The air over Germany, once considered the exclusive domain of the bombers, was now a fiercely contested battleground, where every mission was a gamble against an increasingly sophisticated and deadly defense. Now, the German crews, once mocking, now respected the formidable firepower of the Flying Fortress, a respect born of bitter experience and the sight of comrades falling to those unforgiving lines of 50 caliber fire. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, by late 1943, began to receive the grim arithmetic of attrition. Fighter production, though impressive in raw numbers, was increasingly consumed by a losing equation. The daily sortie rates of the Jagdwaffe against the American bomber streams demanded a constant influx of airframes and, more critically, experienced pilots. Damage reports from interception missions against the B-17s and B-24s, meticulously compiled by Technische Amt analysts, showed a disproportionate number of German aircraft requiring extensive repairs or being written off entirely, often due to the concentrated fire of the bomber formations. Production logs from Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulfs factories indicated that while monthly output of Bf-109s and Fw-190s sometimes exceeded 2,000 units, the operational strength of fighter units rarely reflected these figures. A significant percentage of new aircraft were immediately diverted to replacement pools for units that had suffered heavy losses in the prior week's engagements. The average lifespan of a frontline fighter pilot, according to Luftwaffe personnel records from November 1943, had plummeted to just over 10 combat missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. This rapid turnover created an insatiable demand for pilot training, which in turn strained fuel and aircraft resources, further exacerbating the operational crisis. The logistical burden extended beyond the airframes themselves. The sheer volume of ammunition expended by the bomber fleets, particularly the 50 caliber rounds, had a tangible impact on German war production. While direct comparisons of ammunition output were difficult due to differing calibers and production priorities, the strategic implications were clear. Every damaged German fighter required not just repair materials, but also the skilled labor to effect those repairs, diverting resources from the production of new machines or other critical war material. The industrial base, already under strain from Allied bombing, struggled to keep pace with both the losses and the demand for new equipment. Interrogation files of captured American airmen, though often providing limited technical intelligence, consistently highlighted the confidence derived from the bombers' defensive firepower. These reports, often dismissed as morale-boosting propaganda in early analyses, gradually informed a more sober understanding within the Luftwaffe High Command. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots facing an increasingly well-defended opponent was also a factor in declining engagement rates and increasing combat fatigue. The perception of invulnerability, once held by German crews regarding their own aircraft, was now shifting to the heavily armed American formations. The strategic planners in Berlin faced a dilemma: how to counter an enemy whose industrial capacity allowed for both massive aircraft production and the lavish expenditure of defensive ammunition, while simultaneously maintaining a fighter force that was being systematically eroded. The initial derision of the slow, lumbering bombers had given way to a grudging respect for their resilience and the devastating effectiveness of their combined firepower. The air war over Germany was becoming an industrial grinding match, a contest of attrition that favored the side with the deeper reserves of material and manpower. Recommendation: development of heavy cannon-armed interceptors and rocket-equipped fighters. The shift in air superiority was not a singular event, but a gradual, grinding erosion of the Luftwaffe's operational capacity, marked by the increasing lethality of Allied fighter escorts. The P-51 Mustang, with its laminar flow wing and Merlin engine, possessed the range and speed to accompany bombers deep into German territory, a capability that fundamentally altered the dynamics of air combat. The initial German confidence in their ability to intercept unescorted or inadequately protected bomber formations slowly gave way to a grim recognition of their own vulnerability. Interrogation files from captured German pilots dating from mid-1944 frequently detailed the overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters encountered over target areas. One pilot, a veteran of JG-26, described swarms of Mustangs everywhere, a stark contrast to the earlier, more sporadic engagements. The sustained pressure from these escorts meant that even when German interceptors managed to break through, their time on target was severely limited and their return journey fraught with peril. The impact on German aircraft production, while not immediately evident in raw output numbers, became clear in the types of aircraft prioritized. Fighter production soared, while bomber and reconnaissance aircraft output stagnated or declined. Production logs from Messerschmitt AG and Focke-Wulfs Flugzeugbau show a 1944 output of single-engine fighters exceeding 20,000 units, a desperate attempt to counter the Allied aerial dominance. This focus, however, came at the expense of other vital aircraft types, creating imbalances in the Luftwaffe's overall strength. The strategic implications extended beyond mere aircraft losses. The constant threat from Allied fighters forced German interceptors to engage at higher altitudes and often in less favorable tactical positions, increasing fuel consumption and pilot fatigue. Fuel consumption records from Jagdgeschwader units in late 1944 indicate a significant increase in flight hours per engagement, reflecting the extended chases and evasive maneuvers required. This further strained Germany's dwindling fuel reserves, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of attrition. The ground-based radar network, once a formidable defensive asset, also found its effectiveness diminished. While still capable of detecting incoming raids, the sheer volume of Allied aircraft and the accompanying electronic countermeasures often overwhelmed its capacity to direct interceptors efficiently. Post-war analysis of German radar logs reveals periods of complete saturation, where individual targets became indistinguishable amidst the electronic clutter, rendering precise vectoring impossible. The psychological toll on German aircrews was profound. The initial bravado, once fueled by relatively easy kills against early, less protected bomber formations, eroded into a pervasive sense of dread. Unit diaries from bomber crews, once filled with detailed accounts of successful missions, began to reflect a growing fatalism, with references to the inevitable escort and the wall of fire encountered over the Reich. The 50-caliber machine gun, once underestimated, had become the defining instrument of their aerial demise. The shift in air power ultimately contributed to the collapse of German industrial capacity. Without effective air cover, factories, transportation networks, and oil refineries became increasingly vulnerable to sustained Allied bombing. Damage reports from the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production, compiled between 1943 and 1945, document the progressive destruction of key industrial sites, directly correlating with periods of sustained Allied air superiority. The ability to defend the homeland from the air had become the ultimate measure of national resilience. The air war over Germany, initially conceived by some German strategists as a manageable defensive challenge, transformed into a relentless, one-sided attrition. The initial